Now back to Magdalena, and thank you for all your efforts on the project work.
Muchas gracias, Rosana. Vamos a dar un minuto para que vuelvan a sus asientos y podamos continuar con las presentaciones. Muchas gracias. Por favor, les solicitamos que vuelvan a sus asientos para poder continuar con las presentaciones. Muchísimas gracias. Y en función del tiempo, en este momento vamos a dar la palabra a Yukuko, quien nos va a dar una presentación sobre consideraciones de seguridad de las actividades espaciales, NPS, STM, LTS y SDM. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Magdalena, and hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the scenario-based exercise, and I also hope you missed me. Today, I am going to make a presentation on quite a number of topics, so we're gonna rush through them. It's safety consideration of space activities on 1, space debris, 2, space traffic management, 3, long-term sustainability of our space, and then nuclear power sources. I think Rosanna is trying to kill me and overburden me with lots of topics, but I think I'll try and manage. So, safety of operations, space operation. To make it very simple, there's 2 goals. One is to ensure compliance with all the international legal framework that you have heard over this already 2 days, and then, but also to control the risks and don't make any accidents, be responsible, be liable. And it's good that you've already heard the presentation by Chris Johnson this morning on this liability issue, how it works and what will be the occurrence of the outcome of accidents. So, legal basis for safety in space operation. This, I think Chris covered it very, very nicely. So I'm just going to repeat some of the important points so that we refresh kind of the mind because you now got to talk in the scenario-based exercise. But first and foremost important part is Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, where national activities is responsibility of the government, and it's not only the governmental agencies' activity, but non-governmental entities' activity. They're responsible for it. Next, it's the Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, where launching state is liability for damage caused, and the definition of launching state is fourfolded: launches, the one that launches, the one that procures, the one that has the facility of the launching facility, and the one that has the territory. It's launched from its territory. So these are the 4 key issues and of the definition of launching states. And then comes the liability convention. So, for example, re-entry scenario, when the satellites, when you want to do debris mitigation, it comes back to the Earth. You have to think about absolute liability for damage caused on space surface of Earth, or it doesn't say here in the slides, but for example, airplanes. If you crash into airplanes, then you also have absolute liability. Conjunction scenario, if there is an accident out there in space, then it's a fault-based liability. It's like a normal car accident so we have to find who is what responsible for what and what is the fault. So these are the things you have to consider. And then last but not least, Outer Space Article 8 and Registration Convention, registration of space objects, is important because when you have it in your national registry, it triggers your jurisdiction and control over the ownership of the space objects. Now, and then you have this, you have to look into the space situational awareness data so that you can more or less find it to avoid any collisions, or you can also identify which is the coming space object and such. So these are the main just legal basis for the safety operation. Now I'm going to go into the more fun parts. Space debris mitigation. I think if you were not sleeping yesterday, you're familiar with this slide. It's the satellites versus debris, and 7,500 is actual activating satellites, and the rest is debris. And we have also talked that it's amazingly rapidly increasing, so there would be more debris that you would be expecting. Now, when there was this discussion of outer space treaty, it was 1967, that they didn't think about space debris that much. When did they start speaking about space debris and the risks? Let's say it was agreed in 1994, only in 1994, that we should discuss at our committee, COPOS, to include an agenda in the scientific and technical subcommittee. The work plan was made, and a technical report on space debris was also adopted in 1999. It says IADC. IADC is the abbreviation of Interagency Debris Mitigation Committee, which is a committee of, it's not UN committee, it's a committee that is under the framework with all the space agency, let's say major space agencies. So if countries have space agencies, they try to join that group to talk how to mitigate and how to discuss on space debris. So this also triggered the discussion of moving forward on space debris mitigation guidelines. And then in 2007, we finally had the space debris mitigation guidelines adopted. We can also mention that in the same year, there was also a Chinese anti-satellite weapon test, which created a lot of space debris. That also triggered member states to urge and adopt these guidelines, because we saw tremendous debris out there, and once it's there, it impacts everyone's space object. So this was what happened in SDSC, and afterwards it came to the legal subcommittee to discuss on general exchange of information on the national mechanism relating to space debris mitigation measures, which, because we now have a guidelines, the legal subcommittee took over to see how to better implement this topic. And again, I think I pushed something wrong, so it went a bit fast, but we're still on this PowerPoint, apologies. And in 2012, we had also another topic updated, and it's called General Exchange of Information and Views on Legal Mechanism relating to space debris mitigation measures, because we wanted to find out also a possibility on finding legal solutions. There in 2014, we also, in the legal subcommittee, discussed on compendium of space debris mitigation standards, which it means that we have started sharing each space agencies or each government's space debris mitigation guidelines, because every country has decided to more or less have its own standards based on the IADC guidelines and COPOS debris mitigation guidelines. So the minimum is IADC and, or let's say the COPOS debris guidelines, and then comes the IADC, which is a little bit stricter. And then on top of it, the member states decide the fine tuning of the space debris standards in their country. Now, as of 2018, we have a little bit of change in the topic, because it was always about mitigation of space debris, but we added a word remediation, meaning active debris removal from the orbit. So there are now some industries, or let's say universities, developing technology to take away the space debris from orbit and then mitigating it in the end. So this is part of the agenda now. Now, debris, we say debris, but there's a lot of ways to create debris. You cannot imagine. One is to have this propulsion left over, as I said yesterday, that it automatically on its own just explodes itself. And there are some things, for example, accidental collision, and some things like first stage is also a debris. First stage of the rocket is also, when it's used, it's going to be deliberately made into a orbit. It also could be like paint falling apart from the satellite. That could even be a debris. So there are lots of ways that debris is created. And that is why we had this debris mitigation guidelines saying what we could do. And I'm going to go a little bit more into details on what we have agreed. Now, first of all, in 2007, this space debris mitigation guidelines was adopted. And the important part is not legally binding. And it has to be, it was intended that based on this debris mitigation guidelines, member states will implement it through their regulations or through their legal framework so that it gets complied. So this is the key main factor of this debris mitigation guidelines. And it clearly says in the preamble of this debris mitigation guidelines that this is the intention. That is why it's not legally binding. And there is 7 key guidelines of this mitigation guidelines. It is to first limit debris during normal operation. And this, you could do it by designing. Second, minimize potential for breakers during operational phases. This also, you could do it by designing. So 3, limit accidental collision in orbit, which you can engage in more of how to assess the orbital situation and find out a way to avoid it. And then 4, avoid intentional destruction and other harmful activities. This 4 is something that you might want to just have it in your mind, because when this was adopted, also it impacted the disarmament side of space activities, because this avoiding intentional destruction can or may cover the anti-satellite weapon tests. So yes, yesterday I said to replying to some of the participants' questions that disarmament, it's getting there. We're discussing. We haven't been able to define the space weapons. Yes, this is difficult, but there is another way to approach disarmament by trying to focus on the scientific and technical side and the safety side. And this is one key point from a disarmament side, that we made it possible to include avoid intentional destructions and other harmful activities. 5, minimize potential for post-mission breakups, and this is also resulting from stored energy. 6, limiting long-term presence in LEO. 7 is GEO. So I give you more clear examples now by another nice infographics that we have. And by the way, I see you taking pictures, but don't worry, if you just simply Google UNOOSA, ESA, space debris infographics, you see a better version in the webpage. So don't worry. I had to cut a lot of things to fit in the PowerPoint presentation. So that way you might find the whole infographics itself. But here, for example, I want to talk about the designing thing. You see that the debris is hitting the solar panel. So what you do, engineers here might, it's an easy question for them, but it's quite predictable when it's in orbit, which side the debris might hit more. So in that sense, engineers are designing so to protect the solar panel or the sides of the, let's say the size of the satellites by putting shields or bumpers, and that already protects the satellites for being disactive. So things could be done that way. Also, I mentioned in the guidelines, there was some points on not designing so that it stays forever in LEO and GEO. So when it is in 35,000 up above in GEO, it stays a long time ago, and it has a picture of a dinosaur. But if it's in, let's say, more into 800 kilometers, it stays there a little bit less, but meaning 100 and 100 to 150 years. And then if it's down to 500 kilometers, it's only 25 years. So when you design, you must find a way that it somehow you can make the satellites re-enter back into Earth so that there is less conjunction in outer space. Something else is the role of re-entries. When it's small, when it's CubeSats, probably you all know it would burn up more or less. But when it's a huge satellite, you would have to find a way to control the satellite so that it doesn't fall into other countries' territories when it happens that there is a part of the satellite not burning up. These things you have to also consider. And space debris and human spaceflight, it's also well-known topic. When there is a simple paint in LEO, it can be orbiting in the speed of 7 kilometers per second. I think that's faster than your Air Force flight planes, jet planes. It's super dangerous. It can just kill the astronaut in a second because it goes through the astronaut spacesuit. So these things you have to also make your engineers design a satellite that has obtained it that would, let's say, not break apart quickly and not fall apart. This is something that needs to be also looked into. So these are the space debris guidelines that really pushes more on the technical side. And it's really weird that the lawyer is explaining the things to the engineers. But this is what the intention of the guideline is. And last but not least, we could also check, monitor what is going on in the space. And the important thing is that we can avoid the collisions. But the problem is, every time you move a satellite to avoid a collision, money will cost in terms of human resources, fuel will be spent extra. You might not have this because of this urgent move. You might have the service just for the time being disappear. These are the things that will cost, and I think it also says here that lots of space agency has to move their satellites time to time because they do want to avoid the collision. So these are the things that is more or less expected to do when you want to mitigate debris. So this is the debris mitigation guidelines and the link to the safety operation. Now, long-term sustainability guidelines. Let's go to the next topic. I also have a fancy infographics here too. LTS guidelines. Why do people talk so much enthusiastic about it? Because it is another version of safety operation of space, where we try to enforce the debris mitigation guidelines and protect the sustainability of outer space. And this was a long discussed topic. It took nearly 8 years to finalize this agenda item, and people say Corpus is slow, consensus never works. It works. It worked for this because everybody agreed on the 21 guidelines. And again, this is not a legally binding agreement, but we expect member states to have this regulated somewhat way in their own policy, legal framework, so that it is going to be preserved and sustainability of the outer space activity is protected in a way. So what is mentioned, there's 4 main parts of this guidelines. And the first part is on policy and regulatory framework for space activities. It talks about why policy is important, why it has to be in regulatory framework so that it preserves the outer space activities and such. And also it talks about supervision of national space activities. It again repeats what is mentioned in the Outer Space Treaty to highlight the importance. And then also talks about practice of registration of space objects. So here, in space debris mitigation, I talked a little bit about the intentional destruction and that it started to go a little bit into supporting the disarmament side by scientific and technological way. But this is also the enhancement of the practice of registering space object is also considered to be important to the disarmament factor, because by sharing these information, member states started to consider that it is actually one of a treaty-based confidence building mechanism among the member states, so that there is transparency. There's no doubt. We know each other and we can trust each other. It's what is expected through the registration of space objects. So that is why we also try to enhance the registration. Safety of space operation. There's a long list of guidelines. There's 10 guidelines. Space operation and how it's to be controlled. These things are there, and that is why, as I said yesterday, a lot of member states started registering space debris and triggered by the LTS guidelines. That's the risk out there. So, and yes, if you also look into the guidelines, you'll see more in depth, but I'm just going to best practice. Some countries even share that they are trying to update the national legislation in accordance to the LTA's guidelines. So since you're still not in that process, but national space legislation, when you're going to look at it, once your space policy is there, maybe LTS guidelines could be one guidelines that could be taken into consideration. Last but not least, scientific and technical research and development is important, because without the engineers, we would not be able to find better ways to mitigate the risks and preserve the sustainability of outer space. So this is also highlighted. I said this LTS guideline was adopted and 21 guidelines there, but still we discussed this topic at the Scientific Technical Subcommittee of COPOS, because there is another round of working group set up, which the working group thinks about adding new norms, new guidelines to it to address more new risks, challenges coming up. They're also doing it because through that working group, they want to also share among member state best practices. And then thirdly, they try to do capacity building to support developing countries and such. So these are the three mandates they have, and they have been trying to promote the LTS guideline through the working group and through the committee, and as I said again, sustainability project of UNOOSA. So, space traffic management. There's a third one, and there's another fourth one coming. So don't be bored so much. But space traffic management is a highlight. This is in day one morning. I mentioned it is thought to be very important. Now, what is space traffic management? It's very hard to reply because there is no clear definition adopted in the United Nations framework. But what I can refer to you is a definition made in 2006 by Cosmic Study on Space Traffic Management. And if you Google the definition of space traffic management, a lot of articles refer to it because this one is broad enough, vague enough, and covers a lot of issues and has potentials. So everybody likes to refer to it because the devils are in the details. So the broad definition is STM means the set of technical regulatory provisions for promoting safe access to outer space and return from outer space to Earth free from physical or radio frequency interference. And yes, this is very broad. So I think Germany, I think ESA or maybe EU is thinking about discussing on a more detailed definition. There are lots of efforts put in to more clarify this definition, but still, again, the devil's are in the details, and we haven't been able to reach consensus in the UN. And we're waiting for some of the member states to propose a nice definition so that we can move forward with this topic. But what I can say now is that what are we doing? We're not just waiting for member states to work on. We are already starting the work of what can we be contributing to space traffic management. So again, I want to reiterate that maintaining registration of object launch into space, this already contributes to the transparency and confidence building measures. And this is actually the only treaty-based information sharing mechanism. So I think through that, we believe we're contributing to the space traffic management. We're supporting implementation of the LTS guidelines and the IADC guidelines, space debris mitigation guidelines adopted by the UN. And we're also trying to utilize our networking power to do capacity building on space law, why it's important to comply and abide by these treaties and guidelines, and actively engage with space stakeholders. So, and we try to do social media campaigns and such, and that is why you've seen lots of fancy presentations from my end, because we have been investing in infographics, because these days it's easy for you to get information through Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. So we're focusing in that raising awareness efforts. We had also through 2015 to 2017, a collaboration with ICAO, the air traffic management side, to find discuss this topic, which there was 16 observations adopted, including one related to space traffic management. But that is just an observation. It's not yet anything set up. But these are the things we're trying to do. And when it comes to the work of the committee specifically in terms of space traffic management, again, it started from the 2006 Cosmic Study. And late in 2000, there was lots of requests from member states to set up a proposal on a working group, which would discuss on the guidelines of space traffic management. It never was set up because there was no agreement. In 2016, there was a new agenda on the legal subcommittee regarding legal aspects of space traffic management. So we weren't able to agree on a working group to discuss details, but we at least started to start from the general exchange of views. And then 2019, in parallel, we have been discussing on the LTS, and we managed to have it adopted. And the LTS guidelines has many relevant aspects to the space traffic management. So that is, we believe it's one achievement in terms of contributing to the space traffic management discussion. And in 2021, discussion is still continuing at PROPOS and its subcommittee, So this is, and in, I guess I should have updated, it's 2023, it's still continuing. So this is what we're trying to do. And we hope that through, again, the Secretary General's Common Agenda and Summit of the Future coming up in 2024, we can find a nice a way forward in finding a solution for the space traffic management. So this is the same slide that I used yesterday. And we believe that the development of global space traffic rules must be comprehensive, detailed, throughout, and inclusive as possible. So we hope that this could be done and we can contribute in somewhat way. Now, nuclear power sources. I hope this is the last topics that I have to cover, but I know I understand that you haven't yet engaged in nuclear power sources development, but please allow me to explain. We have already set up principles and safety frameworks, how to govern, how to best operate and use nuclear power sources applications to space activities. We have in 1992 a principle adopted, principle relevant to the use of nuclear power sources in outer space. And then in 2009, we have an even more detailed safety framework adopted together with the Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, to how to use the nuclear power sources application in outer space. Now, just a quick definition of nuclear power source. In the 2009, it has a definition and it says all devices that make use of any form of energy generated by a nuclear reaction is considered to be nuclear power sources. And this, when you are doing any activity related to nuclear power sources, please read in details because there are lots of detailed regulations you must follow, especially when it comes to IAEA standards. They are very strictly regulated. And this is, the two of them are talking about how to prevent accidents. Now, should there be any accidents happening on Earth, IAEA has other two conventions on early notification of nuclear accidents. And sorry, again, I forgot to turn the slide on, but there is a convention on early notification on the nuclear accident. And then also assistance in the case of nuclear accident or radiological emergency. Please let me know when I forget to do that slide because I feel so bad. But I have to turn to the next slide. Okay, just a brief history of nuclear power sources. Why do we need nuclear power sources application in outer space? Because when you have a mission plan for a long duration, you might not have enough energy. When you have a mission that will take far away from the sun, you won't have solar power. That is why NPS is important. So it goes to like Mars missions and such beyond the far away into the orbit. And when did we start using this? It's already started in the 1960s. Even Apollo mission has nuclear power sources applied. USA and USSR started this NPS activities. And I think in 2014, China also started doing nuclear power sources. So there are many states starting to go beyond and take the advantage of nuclear power sources. Now, what happened in 1978? Christina yesterday mentioned about this USSR Cosmos 954 crashed into Canadian territory. Boom. And it has nuclear power sources. It was a major issue because it's radioactive things are all in the Canadian territory. And it was near the borders of USA. So USA also supported Canada, and they did an operation called Operation Morning Light. It's a very nice name, isn't it? I love this operation because it's very interesting. It was still snowing in Canada. So for them, the Canadian and USA military forces worked together and collected all the snow that may have contained radioactive parts, and they tried to do it by end of April because by then they expected that there will be morning lights, meaning spring is coming, and before the snow melts, they wanted to work on it. So they worked on it with all their efforts, and they used 6 million Canadian dollars. And in the end, as Christina said, there was no, let's say, in legal terms, there was no damage caused according to the liability convention. So the USSR didn't agree to that there is a dispute, and they, as a compromise on a diplomatic form, they only paid back 3 million US dollars, meaning half of what has been spent by Canadians. So this was the issue, and when this happened, it triggered the UN again. When something accident happens, it always comes to the UN, and that is why we started talking in scientific technical subcommittee on aspects of how to safely operate using the nuclear power sources. And then beyond, we have the IAEA also taking over this topic in a sense of safety and security relevant studies. So I would just, because you're not yet at probably discussing the nuclear power sources, but still it's interesting to highlight as a safety operation, I would like to highlight some of the principles from the NPS principles and some of the safety frameworks. Now, NPS principles, it's really, let's say, it's not a treaty. It's in the end a resolution. However, it has a word, shall. And I'm so sorry to the interpreters because I don't know what's the difference between should and shall in Spanish, but for lawyers, when we talk about should and shall, it has a very different interpretation. Shall is considered to have legal obligations, whereas with NPS principles, it's not a treaty. So if you look at the other principles, it doesn't use shall, but this one is intentionally using shall because member states somehow agreed at that stage that this is very important, and if we don't comply with it, we will be covered with radio waste, and it would damage Earth. So that is the really uniqueness of NPS principles. And what I have to say is launching states shall, prior to the launch, conduct through and comprehensive safety assessment, meaning a safety assessment with the IAEA standards has to be done. And usually member states do a very thorough nuclear power sources assessment, which is like this big of paper document, and they share it with the UN that they did this to prove that they did this prior to the launch and prove that it is safe. Safety assessments and the timeline shall be made publicly pursuant to Article 11 of Outer Space Treaty. So they send it to UN, and through this Article 11 framework, UN always provides it and makes it publicly available on the assessments that were made. So these are the things we have been doing, and every country who is using nuclear power sources has been abiding by these principles. So I think this year we received some notification from Russia. That was the most recent one. And every year we kind of have a few member states approach us on this nuclear power sources. So it's constantly updated on our webpage. Member states will need to notify the re-entry when there's nuclear power sources coming back to Earth. And then when there is a re-entry, assistance to states should be made by the launching states, so that some of the countries that might expect that nuclear power sources to come down, if that comes down, launching states really need to be liable and help out the state that might have damage or just have the nuclear power sources land in their territory. Now, NPS safety framework is also something more details. It has lots of requirements to request to governments. And it's not only the governments. I'm listing a lot of governments here in the slides because you're more or less in the governmental side, but it also includes guidance for management of the organization who will be involved in NPS application. So for example, if there is an institution or space agency, or let's say a university who will be managing the NPS sources, they also are directly governed by the safety framework, and they should be complying it. This is something very also unique, because we've been telling you, international space law, it's all about government, but here it's specific because it's nuclear power sources. So these are the things you really need to discuss, and to enforce this, I would say, even though it's universities or this management of organization is mentioned here, even though we would like the government to set up a nice policy regulations so that this is really regulated through national law. So this is what we have been asking, and I try to rush through all my slides now. So this is the end of my presentation on safety space operations. So thank you very much for your time and listening to the lovely regulations that you will have to follow in the future. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Yukuko, por la presentación, y debido al tiempo vamos a dar espacios para un par de preguntas solamente. Te dejo el micrófono abierto.
The question is related to the capacity of COPUOS to assist states in technical issues related to the space traffic management or some orbital situations that could require some resources to be solved. For example, for most of the operation, the end of life of the satellite is an issue that would require budget to be solved technically. So I don't know if inside Caucus there is an organization that could be consulted for this kind of assistance technically.
So when it comes to end of life, it's purely responsibility of the government, and we do not have, like, let's say, when you say extra resources, meaning fundings or
technical assistance.
Technical assistance. So in that sense, I think we're happy to, if you contact us, we may be able to connect you. UNOOSA might be able to support you in finding a nice expert in that regard. But it also is that we also encourage you, because what it is discussed in the scientific technical subcommittee, although it's talking about science, it's mainly about how to figure out the political side and fixing up the science. So it's not into details of science and technology or engineering. Things are not really discussed, and that is where those things are discussed more in the interagency debris mitigation committee, which is the does it need to be a space agency? I think that is the minimum requirement, right? So it would be nice that if there is a space agency, we always recommend the member states to coordinate and join this group. But since you don't have a space agency, you might want to reach out to those who are involved in IADC and find a way that they can kind of support you or also guide you on the personal expertise and such. But these are the things we are not being probably be able to support you in terms of engineering side for the time being. Hopefully we can launch a project soon, but for the time being, we do not have such project at the moment. Thank you.
Hi, Yukuko. I have a question. Is there any legal framework being discussed in terms of the environmental regulations for the operations on celestial bodies?
So, good question. We have legally binding treaties all adopted from the 60s to the 70s, which we never thought of environmental impact to outer space. I can also mention to you that maybe this, and even IAEA, I said, if there is an accident, they have already a convention of how to help this nuclear accident, but this only applies to Earth. For the time being, there is no nuclear accident. How to solve this in the moon or in the celestial bodies. This is also the same in the context of legal binding frameworks. However, we have this group of scientists, COSPAR is one of the biggest institutions where they talk about space science, and there they talk about planetary protection, meaning and how to regulate some guidelines, to set up guidelines to preserve the environment. So if you're interested, please look for COSPAR meetings on planetary protection, and this will be discussed. And today, I think it's Nicholas is today, right? So Nicholas, our former boss, will be making a presentation on what is discussed at COSPAR in terms of planetary defense, meaning asteroids hitting Earth, and then planetary protection, meaning preserving the environment of a celestial body. So this is actually the right timing that you asked, and hopefully you are interested in listening to Nicholas's presentation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por las preguntas y Yukuko por la presentación. Para finalizar y antes de irnos al horario de almuerzo, un par de tips de alimentación. Dentro del mapa, como ven, tenemos la recomendación de 3 lugares. El primero de ellos en el Club Providencia, en Avenida Octubre. El segundo, Dolce Encelato, en Eliodoro Yáñez. Y el tercero, Oxxo, también en Eliodoro Yáñez. Con esto damos terminada la sesión de la mañana y los esperamos a las 2:45 para iniciar con la sesión de la tarde. Muchísimas gracias.